Well, I think a lot of things are ending besides the war in Ukraine. I think NATO is reaching its sell point, sell due date, whatever you want to call it. I think the European Union is crumbling. I think the governments in Berlin, Paris, and London are extremely fragile. Their approval ratings are down in, some people say, the high teens. Others say, around 30% or less. And as far as the battlefield is concerned, at least the reports that I'm being exposed to say that you have large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers now who are people that have been at most a week in uniform. They've had virtually no training and have been sent forward ostensibly to be killed. Then others are now disguising themselves as women in order to find their way through the lines. The Russians are treating them as humanely as possible because they're simply shaking their heads in disbelief that this sort of nonsense is continuing. I think the Russians are also moving some forces over the river that are now in and around Odessa. I was told yesterday that Russian special operations forces roam freely during the night around Odessa and in Kiev, because you have these long periods where you have no illumination, no lighting, no energy for it. And so they can put on their night vision devices and wander around without interference. I think this whole thing is coming to a very tragic but predictable end. And I think the Russians are concerned now with what happens as this thing crumbles. Now, they can't force the Europeans to do much, but I think the Europeans are foolish to believe that there's anything they can do to influence the outcome other than be willing to sit down and talk to the Russians. The most interesting aspect of this whole thing is now this new national security document that's come out, which has no strategy per se. It's simply a set of assertions. And the assertion that is most troubling to the Europeans is the recognition that we're not going to stay in Europe in perpetuity. We're not going to maintain our forces there in perpetuity. We're going to leave. And the question is, how do you do it? How fast does this happen? And naturally, what the Europeans don't realize is that while inevitably there is a critical need to reduce the American defense spending habit, the Congress on the Hill wants to add more money to defense because they line their pockets as a result. Their donors profit. Some of their constituents retain jobs. So it's a strange set of circumstances. And I don't see any real direction other than we're going to pull in our forces from Europe initially. And then eventually, I think we'll see the same thing happen in Korea and Japan. We can't afford anything. We're financially ruined. We're broke. Nothing is improving. I was shown a statistic yesterday that said that in the last 22 months, 30% of all the dollars that have ever existed were printed. Let's stop and consider that. That is an enormous sum of money. I don't know how many trillions it amounts to, but to stop and think that 22 months, that short period, we printed 30% of all the dollars that have ever existed, tells you we're in a lot of trouble. Now, we haven't had the complete collapse here yet, but I think it's coming.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned this new national security strategy because it's very hard to sometimes predict what Trump's going to do. He tends to go a lot of back and forth in terms of how he wants to end the Ukraine war as well. But with this new security strategy, it seems like we have something concrete on paper. So in terms of how Trump wants to approach this. But what does this new security strategy tell you about how the US will deal likely with the Ukraine war? I mean, it does deal with it directly, but I guess the wider ideas put forth in this document.
I don't think there's a great deal that President Trump can do. I don't think there ever was. This was one of the criticisms I had with the dithering over the last 12 months. In fact, before he was elected, I was suggesting strongly that once he was elected to the presidency and was inaugurated, that he should begin the process of disengaging. There's not much that can be done at this point. The opportunity for Washington leading NATO in a different direction was lost back in 2022 when the first opportunity came in the form of an agreement reached in Turkey, in Istanbul. That was rejected out of hand. Subsequent discussions were all meaningless because everyone was convinced that Russia, given enough time, would fall apart, that Russia was weak, the government would not stand, that Putin was the evil dictator, that under these circumstances would be willingly removed by his population. Well, it's all nonsense. But we stuck with this mantra, and even after Trump began to sober up in the run-up to his election, once he was in office, he began repeating all the lies that had become standard in NATO and across the West that were prevalent in the media. The outrageous claims of heavy Russian casualties when the Russians were taking casualties, but they weren't the heavy ones. The heavy casualties were being taken by the Ukrainians. I mean, you just had a debate and touched on some of these subjects with this British, I guess he was an admiral. I don't remember. Was he an admiral or a general? People are still living in fantasy world here in the United States and in Western Europe. The average American knows that things aren't going well economically. But, a sledgehammer is coming at you, but until it finally hits you over the head, you don't really understand what it means. I think that's kind of where we are with everything right now in the West. We're in a funk, as they say, a twilight zone between reality and fantasy. Reality is coming. You can see it. It's like looking at a train that's coming down the tracks, a locomotive. It's headed for you. But until it arrives at the station, you're suspicious. You're skeptical. No, it's not really coming, but it is. So I don't think this is a strategy document. There is no strategy. Strategy means that there's a coherent framework. There are guideposts. Sometimes you can call them guide rails. In other words, these are the areas where we're going to focus. This is what's strategically vital and important to the United States. This is where we're going to remain committed, engaged, and so forth. What we have is this vague notion. Well, we're going to focus on the Western Hemisphere, where we want to be dominant. Okay, well, we are already dominant in the Western Hemisphere, but apparently somebody's decided we need to invade Venezuela to demonstrate just how dominant we are, which I think is a very dumb idea, but that's prevalent in Washington. We have to signal to everyone that this is our hemisphere, we're in charge. And then you say to them, well, have you talked to Moscow and Beijing? Well, what do you mean? I said, well, they seem to think they're dominant in Asia and dominant in Eurasia and Europe. Have you talked to them about their interests? No. Where everything is done in isolation here in Washington from what happens anywhere else. We're not really taking those things into consideration. The only good part of this is Trump's personal input. Now, what is Donald Trump's personal input? First of all, it's we're not paying for NATO anymore. He's been against that for years. So NATO is going to be on its own. That's fine. Thank you. Now, how are we going to do that? That's absent. There's no discussion of how you move through some sort of process to Europeanize NATO. Well, it's probably irrelevant because I don't think Europe is going to retain NATO. There was a point in time in the 90s when you could have had a Europeanization. But now Europe is fiercely divided. It was always difficult to move as one. Moving Europeans collectively in a direction, sort of like herding cats, it's not going to happen. So you're going to end up with new security arrangements across the continent. Russia is going to play a role in that, whether we like it or not. So what's the long-term strategic focus and forecast other than we want to be dominant in the Western Hemisphere? We're no longer apparently preparing for war against China, at least not based upon what I read. And we no longer really want to go to war with Russia, based upon the sort of assertions that I read in the document. That's not a strategy, Glenn. That's just an expression of preferences.